So my name is Joshua Karasak. I'm a winemaking specialist with Enartis USA. Welcome to our webinar. We have a really exciting topic today on canned wine. The title is New Information for Preparing Wines for Canning. So just a little bit of background information on how the webinar works before we actually get started. So there is a recording in progress. So just keep in mind that after the presentation, if you lose connection or you can't see some part of the presentation, it'll be available to you after the presentation is complete. So no worries there. If you are planning on asking a question at the end of the presentation, just keep in mind that if there's any sensitive information, this is going to be a published video online. So just hold that sensitive information off until later time. If you are experiencing a bad connection, we do recommend just exiting and re-entering the webinar through the link that you received in your email. And usually that fixes the connection issue. Please use the chat box over on the right-hand side of the menu for the question and answer at the end of the webinar. If you use it during the webinar, it can just become a little bit distracting for others. If you find that it's a distraction and you want to close off the chat box, you can click the little arrow on the left-hand side of the chat box, and that'll close off the chat box and open up the screen a little bit for you. Also, if you do use the chat box, please be respectful to others. So in this webinar, we're hoping to address some questions that are related to canning. The 4 questions that we're hoping to answer is what makes a can unique form of packaging? And we have George Crochiere from Crochiere and Associates to help us answer that question. Next question is what factors contribute to reduction appearing in canned wines? How can winemakers avoid reduction appearing in canned wines? And what treatments are available to prepare wines for canning? So here's our agenda for today. First is going to be George Crochiere from Crochiere and Associates. He's going to give us a packaging perspective, what makes a can different from a bottle or more traditional packaging. Then we have Neil Scrimgeour from the Australian Wine Research Institute, and he's going to be talking about understanding and mitigating the development of reductive characters in canned wines. Eric Wilkes will be joining us as well from the Australian Wine Research Institute, and the title of his presentation is Wine in Cans, A Tale of Two Metals, with various supporting players. And then I'll finish off the webinar with a presentation on analysis and treatments for canned wine. After all the presentations are over, we'll have a question and answer session. In that question and answer session, you have about 20 or 30 minutes where we'll be able to ask questions, and we'll field your questions in as many questions as we can in that period of time. Before we get into George's presentation, I just want to launch another quick poll question. So the question is, do you can wine? And what is your experience with canning wine? So we have 4 answers here. I make canned wines. I've dabbled in canning wines. I'm thinking about canning wines. And I'm just here for the information. So I'll give everybody a few minutes to just kind of answer through that survey. So it looks like most everybody's voted at this point. So I'll go ahead and voting and share that. So it looks like a lot of people are making canned wines. About 27% of us. 9% of us have made canned wines occasionally. 27% are thinking about canning wines. And then another 23% are here just for curiosity. So now we're going to go into George's presentation. So a little bit about George before we get started. He's the president and co-owner of Crochiere and Associates LLC. Since 1977, George has worked with polymers ranging from development of plastics and rubber materials while working for Spalding to working as a technical manager of coating and closure systems for W.R. Grace in North America. He's worked most recently with beverage, bottle, and closure and plastics manufacturers, providing services and test results that lead to improved shelf life, performance, and consistency in their packaged materials. George is also currently working as a materials development manager at Vibram. So George, are you there? Hello, George.
Hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, there's a delay. All right, so I just want to get into this from the perspective of the materials and the performance of the can. Just so you all know, I've worked with a lot of breweries and wineries. I don't make either. I like to consume them. So I look at this as I am the customer of the work I do, and that's kind of how I look at this and pick what I want, how I want my product to taste. All right, so let's take a look at what we're going to cover. We're going to look at the oxygen or lack of it, um, barrier coatings, to keep it in perspective. The coating is there to protect the can from the beverage, not the other way around. Pack testing, what's important to evaluate the coating in the can, storage and interaction issues, and some kinds of information to collect in communication. So on oxygen issues, most packages have too much oxygen. Cans may not have enough. We've seen this in other industries for years. I've worked with oxygen scavengers and barrier materials for many years, evaluating what's better and always trying to improve them. Cans, we have the other issue. We have no oxygen ingress. Whatever you get at the beginning is all you're going to see for the rest of the life of the can. So at filling, the cans are flushed, counter pressure filled, liquid nitrogen injected. It gives you very low initial oxygen. The easy open and double seam has zero ingress to speak of. Years ago, I was working on screw caps, and everyone was talking about how good a barrier the tin seals were on screw caps. Those leak like a sieve compared to an aluminum can. And cans have the lowest oxygen levels of all the packages I've dealt with, and I see a typo. Okay. Here's something I found on the internet, and many of you guys might have seen this. You can dissolve the can with acid and leave the coating on the inside. It looks like almost looks like a bag in a can. That's the protective coating that we're concerned about inside the can. That's the biggest part of it, the can liner or internal coating. It should be non-porous. It should protect the can from the wine. But the wine is not touching the aluminum. The wine should only be touching the coating or the plastic. Barrier coatings in cans, there's two to be concerned about. On the easy open end, there is a coating that is applied by coil coating method. Then the ends are made, the rivets are formed, the score lines are made through the coating. Whoops. So that coating is applied before the end is made. Typically, these coatings are epoxy esters, polyesters. We've used PVC organosols in the past. They're mostly solvent-based because on the coil coating line, the solvents are burned, so there's nothing going up into the atmosphere. The internal body coating or liner is applied after the can is formed. The can is formed, it has lubricants on it. The lubricants are cleaned off. The aluminum is etched with the cleaner and baked, and the coating is applied to the freshly cleaned can after it's made. After the coating's applied, it's baked, and then the shoulder is formed on the can as a final step. Typically, can coatings have been waterborne for the last 30, 40 years. But that's the one that gets the most attention when we're looking at can coatings is the body coating. For a barrier coating to work, we look at three things. Is it properly cured? Is it properly applied? And have we got the right chemistry? If any one of these is not done right, you've got nothing. So take a look at each one. Proper cure equals optimum properties. These coatings are usually cross-linked, which means that during the curing process, first the solvent evaporates, or the water, and then you get the cross-linking between the different monomers in there to get a cross-link density and build up your chemical properties. Sometimes when they're introducing a new coating, it may not cure as fast, and so people have got to increase the temperature or lengthen the time in the oven. On a production line, you may not be able to lengthen the oven time, so you have to play temperature. Uncured coatings are going to be weak. They're going to fall off. Overcured coatings will be dark yellow or brown, and they can be brittle. One of the tests that used to be done, it's very basic, but when I was doing a lot of work on can coatings, we would check the cure by taking a piece of cheesecloth with MEK and counting how many times you could rub it before the coating comes off. Some of the coatings that we use on food cans, you might have to rub it 60 times before you could get through the coating. Other ones that we used on beer crowns might go three rubs. And you had to know the chemistry in order to know what was good, what was bad. Proper application to get optimum properties. With a spray, I don't know if you guys have done any spray painting, with an aerosol can or spray painting a car or a house. If the spray is not adjusted right, you can get pinholes, you can get incomplete film coverage. Ideally, you want it to be nice, uniform flow and even coverage. A low film weight is going to save money, but because it's thinner coating, you've got worse barrier properties. Heavier film weight, you're going to have better barrier properties, but it's going to cost more. If you see a can with a blister in or a puddle at the bottom, they probably put a little too much on. But I would be nervous about that because in the drying process, you might have trapped solvent in there, and you could end up with porosity if you had a situation like that. If you need extra barrier properties, a lot of times people have gone to 2 coats are better than 1 heavy coat. Although I don't know if it's ever been done in beverage cans, but we do it in sanitary cans or food cans. When they're making the cans, there's this, Waco has made this, and other companies make them. It's called an enamelator. They take the can, they put a little electrolyte salt water in there, put an electrode in there, ground the can, and check the current that travels through the coating. Ideally, you want to get nothing. As far as the ends go, they have the jig on the right where they put the end on there, tip it over, the electrolyte touches it, and they measure the ends the same way. The whole point here is we don't want any porosity, any current going through, so that you have a nice uniform coverage and protective barrier. Coating chemistry. The big thing now, everyone's talking about BPA. As a coating chemist, BPA is my favorite monomer because that goes into making epoxy resins. And if you want performance, you want chemical resistance, you want toughness, you want adhesion, you start with epoxy. And that's usually the premium product for that application. If you use something that's BPA free, it means it doesn't use a traditional epoxy resin. So that is only telling you what it's not. The type of coatings that could be BPA free are polyesters, acrylics, vinyls, PET, anything but epoxy resin. One thing that has come out in the last few years, Valspar has worked on this, and it is a BPF instead of BPA. they've tested it as an estrogen mimic, and it does not function that way. So they are using it to make epoxy coatings for the can industry. Um, they say that this resin or this monomer is a little bit slower curing, so you'd have to be careful with that if you're making the cans and applying the coatings. But that, to me, it's an epoxy. It still has a great potential for being a good product. And there's good and bad of every type of coating resin. But if I was gambling, I'd start with the epoxies to get the best performance. The other thing about all these different monomers is they will have different sensory effects. We always talk about clean tasting coatings and whatnot, but they still have a residual odor, taste that's going to be typical of that material. And you may not notice it in a can exposure, but if you had a lot of cans together and you stuck your nose inside a sealed bag with a lot of cans, you might pick it up. Okay, which BPA-free coating? Coating companies, chemists have been working on alternatives. And when this first came out, they looked at the polyesters. They looked at the resins that did not work as well as the epoxies did in the past, and they tried to improve their properties. Each coating formula or recipe will have different properties. Resin type is just a starting point. So you may have 5 different polyester coatings, but they're all going to perform differently, and some will work and some won't. Just like the epoxies, some will be better than others. Lab work and trials start with benchtop testing to predict performance and chemical resistance. That's just the starting point. That's a tool to give them a guideline. They end up doing the pack test as the only true evaluation of the coating. And that's where you guys get involved. The coating company goes to the can making company. They put a test to get samples together. One of you tests it, and it may or may not work. Hopefully they've done their homework, and at least they got a good starting point. But it often takes repeated testing and repeated tries to get this to work well. So some of the bad press about BPA-free or non-BPA coatings may just be that you're hearing about early trials, and you got to take good notes. Accurate records of all materials, conditions, and settings of all aspects of the pack test are needed to identify the strengths and weaknesses of each coating. If you're working on the coating, you take notes of everything you see, hear, feel, touch, observe. You don't know, as you're running the test, what factor is going to be the key to solving the problem if something goes wrong. So you just take notes of everything. Afterwards, you compare the notes of different tests, the results, and the notes, and you pick the best packaging for your application. If you're running an ideal pack test, the kind of data that should be collected by somebody, and from your perspective, you may not be able to get all this information, but hopefully you have a lot number or a reference number that will lead to somebody else who does have this information. So we look at the coating manufacturer, where it was made, formula number, the lot number, the date. We look at the coating application conditions, the film weight, the line speed, the bake conditions, any testing that was done there. We look at the can and end maker, what plant they were made at, the lot number, the date, anything special about that. The fill conditions, the line chemistry, line speeds, purge, headspace flush, can pressure, typical initial TPO. Storage conditions, time, temperature, abuse, and your evaluation method. When you do sensory testing, do you tear down the can and look at the inside? Look for stains, look for peels and blisters, and look for cracking to see if something has come apart. Not all things are possible, but the more is better to build a puzzle, build the puzzle or build the picture of what is and isn't working. Yeah, so again, if you're packing it and you know about the fill conditions, hopefully you've collected the lot number or any information you can from the supplier of the cans. Worst case scenario, you can find something that works and then you can't order it again because you didn't take the notes. So you want to find out what does and doesn't work. All right, so here's a couple of different manufacturers and types of coatings that are being offered as BPA free or BPA-NI or whatever they want to call it. Sherwin-Williams has got this new epoxy. They purchased Valspar, so there's a Valspar material with this new epoxy resin made from bisphenol F. They're using it in body sprays and ends. They've also got their Valpure V30 and 60 for ends. It's a polyester. And they also have a body spray that's an acrylic. PPG is doing acrylics and polyesters for bodies and ends. Axel Nobel has got their Aqualure body spray. It's a BPA-NI, which is not intentional. Some people have asked me what non-intentionally added means. When I've worked for coating companies and we were asked, did you add any of, does this coating contain any BPA? And my response is usually, I didn't add any. I don't know of any in there. But if you're going to make me sign to something that says it'll never have one molecule of BPA, I can't do that because you never know what kind of analysis is going to be done. You know, did it go through a pipe where there was a little bit of an epoxy resin patch on a seal or something? You don't know, you don't commit to it. And so that's why they have not intentionally added. It's clean, it doesn't have any, but they're just covering themselves in case somebody analyzes and finds a molecule of it later on. The one that's odd is Diocecan. They're laminating the can end and body with PET plastic, and they're making the cans out of that. Storage interactions and issues. The wine is inside a polymer bag. It's within the can. It's not touching the aluminum. But there shouldn't be any interaction with the aluminum. There is interaction with the polymer coating. Most polymer materials contain a variety of additives and modifiers, and these can interact with the wine. Types of polymer interactions, things that affect sensory properties, flavor scalping or absorption. This is where the polarity of the polymer is similar to something in the beverage, and it absorbs this. The typical thing that is easy to visualize is when you take a plastic container, you put some tomato sauce with some spaghetti sauce in there, you dump it out, and the inside of the container is now red. That coloring, that oil was scalped or absorbed by the plastic. You can remove it with heat and scrubbing and extracting it. But it does affect the flavor of the beverage. Some of the materials that have been known for scalping, polyethylene, silicone, polypropylene. Some of the plastics that are known for not scalping are PET and PVDC or Saran or Saranex. Another thing, it matches with the polarity or the solubility parameter of the polymer and the flavor molecule. The other thing is additive extraction. So flow agents, waxes, process aids that are in the coating or the polymer can be extracted by the beverage. A lot of things are, the higher the alcohol level, the more you can extract usually. And these can cause you flavor issues. And again, this is where a small additive in a coating in one formula that's not in another one can make the difference between good and bad flavor. Interactions that affect the package, liquid absorption by the polymer. So if you had a coating that wasn't cured completely or had very low moisture alcohol resistance, after some extended storage or maybe a high temperature, the coating would absorb the liquids. It would cause the polymer to swell. It would get foggy. The other ones are chemical reactions. This would be degradation of the film, the coating, and eventually the metal. So if something attacked the coating that was in there, maybe you had a strong acid in your coating, might be a problem. Possible effects in cans, sensory changes due to scalping or extraction, surface tension due to coating surfactants. So this is something I used to hear about in the beer industry. Sometimes people put defoamers in the coatings. That defoamer might be a silicone oil. That oil is going to be on the surface of the coating, and when you put your wine in the can or any other package with a coating, that can get into wine and will affect the surface tension of your wine when you pour it into a glass and look at it. So it's just a little side effect that may or may not be an issue, but it's something you should be aware of. Internal coating failure, we talked about this a little bit before. Blush, blisters, peeling, can failure, corrosion, holes, leakage. I know you guys worry a lot about sulfur. In the food industry, corn, tuna, many products have sulfur, and sanitary can coatings have been developed to prevent sulfur staining of the metal. And there's a whole world of work done on that over the decades. So you're not alone. Storage conditions, high temperature exposure. If you're packaging in glass and you want to accelerate the storage conditions and you elevate the temperature, not much is going to happen with the glass. It's going to get hotter. You're going to cook the wine. You're going to destroy it. You're going to increase oxygen ingress and oxidation. In a polymer coating, whether this is a coating in a can, a bag-in-box, a pouch, a plastic bottle, any waxes or process aids that have a melt point above your storage condition will melt, change phase, and could migrate into the package. So when you think about accelerated aging by elevating the temperature, I'd say stay at or below what temperature you're going to see in commerce. A lot of times people talk about a car or a truck will see 140 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun. I wouldn't go much beyond that for a storage condition because, that's a temperature you might see in the real world. So an accelerated test, it's fair game. But if you go up to 160, 180 Fahrenheit, you're never going to see that in the real world. You're going to cause degradation of the polymer and the additives, and you're going to cause false negatives. So, as to higher temperatures, your barrier properties are going to suffer. I've seen this a lot with bag-in-box. You're not going to see the problem with cans so much because the aluminum is protecting it, but in plastic packaging, I've seen it with bag-in-box. They get to a high temperature and the barrier properties just die off. It is a reversible thing, but the damage to the wine is done. You can get your berry properties back, but your damage is already done. Cleanliness, again, with the cans, you guys all know this. The top of the can's got to be cleaned if people are going to drink out of it. So that's more of a habit. Hopefully, they've learned that over since they've been drinking soda and beer out of cans. Final packaging selection. All package options are a compromise. No package is perfect. Um, Can, bag, and box, screw caps, they all have their pros and cons. What matters to you is what you have to decide. Success and failure often depends on the little details. Like I said, uh, a defoaming agent in the coating might cause you flavor issues or surface tension issues. Um, Little things like that. Um, Big temperature of the coating. My advice is if when I've worked with large companies who can afford to do pack tests of 10 different coatings or cans, they do all their work, they keep it all secretive, they make their final selection, everybody jumps through hoops to help them. You guys are a small compared to the beer and soft drink industry. So far you might grow bigger. Right now you've got to rely on networking with each other to try and compare notes. Take good notes when you run your test and compare with each other and join as a team to get to the bottom of this. One last thing about the BPA free, it's a new family of coatings. They're going to have growing pains. Some of the coatings will be tested and fail. Some will be improved upon. Um, Eventually, they'll have something that works well for everything, probably. But it may take time and you need some patience. All right. Something we've decided we're going to start doing is we've set up a website, if you guys want to, where people can share their experiences, both good and bad, about pack tests. And hopefully we can, if we get enough people into the information, we will sort it out and establish a database of which coatings are working well with which types of beverages. So this is something you can look into. Um, we've been working on it a little bit. We're still working on it, but if you check that website there, it's something if you're interested in taking part in, maybe it can help save you some time and money. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, George. That was certainly a really interesting presentation. I think we all know a lot more about cans and polymers now, so that was really great. So thank you so much. Before we get into Neil's presentation, I just want to do one more quick poll question, and so I'll launch that right now. Question is, what kind of canned product will you make if you are going to make canned wine? White, rosé, red, sparkling, or other? And I'll give you guys just a few seconds to go ahead and answer this one. It looks like we have most of the answers in right now, so I'll go ahead and end the voting and share the results. So this is kind of what I expected to see. Most of us are going to be making white and rosé. Smaller amount of us making some red, another smaller portion making sparkling, and then this other section. So there's some other creative products being made there as well. So very interesting results to see. Thank you for sharing. So now we're going to move on to Neil Scrimgeour. He is working with the Australian Wine Research Institute. Neil works as a senior scientist for Commercial Services Division. He manages research for new winemaking technologies, saving the industry money and improving quality. Neil, are you there? Let's give him a second to turn on his microphone.
Hi, Joshua, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Excellent.
All right, you're good to go.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. So my presentation this afternoon's entitled Understanding and Mitigating the Development of Reductive Characters in Canned Wines. So really the focus of my presentation is an applied research trial that we've been running at the Australian Wine Research Institute for about the last 18 months, and I'll share some of the key learnings to date from that trial. The following presentation from Dr. Eric Wilkes will continue on with some of the other outcomes from that trial and some of the mitigation work we've been looking at. I thought it would be worth just commenting on how we actually got here in terms of wine in a can. There's obviously been a huge number of developments in packaging, in wine packaging, over certainly over the last few years, but certainly over the centuries. There's been many interesting developments, right back to the early bottles that you see in the top left-hand corner from sort of 15th, 16th, 17th century. There's been lots of developments in closure technology as well, and then we've seen things like the cask wine product, which is the Angov's product you see on screen, which is over 50 years old now. And then we've got packages like the paper-based bottles you see at the top of the screen, and some of those flat pack PET based bottles that are more geared towards home delivery through the letterbox. More recent developments in the industry, both here and in the US, focus more on reduced volume serving size. So I moved more towards responsible serving sizes, which play into the benefits such as convenience, portability, and certainly with aluminium cans, sustainability, certainly in relation to wine glass bottles. Now, the market for canned wine has grown exponentially over the last few years, especially in the US. Recent Nielsen data up to the end of the calendar year 2019 shows about an 80% growth in canned wine for the 52-week period, in comparison to bottled wine sales from off-premise outlets growing by roughly 1.5%. So in a fairly stagnant market, canned wine is certainly accelerating from a fairly small base, but there's clearly a lot of interest in the format itself. Growth in Australia is also tracked upwards over the last few years. It's probably not grown as quickly as it has in the US, so I'm not entirely sure why that is. That may be related to some of the patent restrictions around putting wine in a can, and potentially around some of the market acceptance noises we've been hearing from some of the wine producers over here in terms of perceived quality of wine products in a can. So there's a bit of a perception that certainly in previous years it's lower quality products that have been going into a can. And what we saw probably about 2 years ago, there was an increase in the prevalence of people with reduction issues. So we were being approached by wine producers and cider producers at the time about perceived reduction issues. So the wine basically having stinky sulfur notes, sort of rotten eggs, cooked vegetable, those sort of characters, after a fairly short time in the can, so literally within a few months of the products being on the shelf. And it became fairly clear that this was a major problem, certainly here in Australia, and that was affecting consumer acceptance in that product format. And obviously that has a knock-on effect to potential market growth as well. And through discussions with US producers that we've worked with in the past, we saw that it was a common issue on both sides of the pond, and we've set up a consortium study to investigate the extent of the problem, better understand the chemistry involved with wine in a can, and to identify some remediation strategies and techniques that can be used. So we're looking for real practical solutions out of this trial. So it is a commercial trial. We have 11 major producers and can suppliers involved, both in Australia and the US, supporting that trial. At this stage, we anticipate that trial will complete probably early next year. So in terms of the different stages of the project, we're sort of 3/4 of the way in at the moment, but in terms of my presentation, I'll focus mostly on the benchmark phase, which is really around understanding the extent of the problem in industry. And I'll start to talk about some of the initial work we carried out here around understanding some of the key chemical pathways that are involved in canned wine. And I say that will lead on to Eric's presentation as well, certainly around some of the mitigation work. So I just want to talk about briefly some of the risk factors around putting wine in a can. So George has already touched on certainly some of these already. The limits I've put against the chemical attributes there are fairly typical for those that you get from a can supplier. So the bodies that undertake the pack tests with a particular can type and a particular wine-based product will typically look at these sort of limits for free sulfur dioxide, copper, and chloride. Now, there are other considerations for how the wine will perform in the can, not least including things like pH, carbon dioxide levels for sparkling products, and alcohol level as well, which I've not put there, but also elements such as ullage or fill height, and TPO, which George again touched on in terms of total package oxygen. They can all have an impact on the chemistry of the wine. In terms of the pack performance and the can performance, it's typically the top 3 attributes that are in focus. There still appears to be some debate about the precise role of copper in all of this, but it certainly appears to play a role in some of the corrosion chemistry involved. I don't intend to go into corrosion chemistry in any degree of detail this morning, other than to flag that copper and chloride both play a role in the pitting process, which occurs in the surface of the aluminium, or the aluminium oxide, to be more precise, that's on the surface of the can. Now, obviously, the barrier sits over the top of that aluminium, but as George has pointed out, it's not completely inert. There is some interaction with the wine and the wine components, and there is the potential for the wine to actually create pits in the surface or pinholes, and there's a potential for aluminium transfer into the product. Now, fortunately for us, aluminium can play a key role in converting some of the sulfur dioxide we have in the wine into hydrogen sulfide, which, for those of you know, has a fairly pungent rotten egg characteristic. It has an extremely low aroma perception threshold. So it doesn't take much aluminium migration into the product to make hydrogen sulfide levels in the wine significant. So now I'm just going to go through a few slides from the benchmarking phase of the project. Essentially, we collected a series of 16 commercial canned wine samples, both from Australia and the US market, and we aim to get those products very soon after they were packaged, so within 1 month of packaging, and we monitor them over about a 5 to 6 month period under normal storage conditions, sort of 17 to 20 degrees storage. So this first chart looks at the aluminium concentration in the wines. Now, if we remember that there is an inherent background aluminium concentration in wine, depending on where it was made in the world and the winemaking process used. As a guide, aluminium levels in Australian wines, for example, for reds would sit somewhere around the 200 to 300 microgram per litre level. Whites slightly higher, which is likely due to the use of bentonite clay in the fining process. But you can see in most cases here, the aluminium levels are significantly above that sort of threshold. The grey coloured bars is essentially what we measured as soon as we received the products, and the blue bars represents what the level was at 5 months in package. So apart from maybe a couple of products, every single one has shown an increase in aluminium, and a steady increase over that period as well. So we did monitor at a couple of different time points, and there was a steady increase, indicating there's a continuous rate of transfer of aluminium into the products. So this obviously creates a new chemical pathway that doesn't exist in bottled wine and glass. So we knew we needed to understand that pathway in a bit more detail. This is just an example of aluminium levels in other carbonated beverages. We thought it was worth just benchmarking where wine sat in relation to other products. Aluminium transfer into canned products is not unique as far as wine is concerned. From the products we tested, the only ones that showed levels that were of a similar level were ciders and kombucha, which is again a fast-growing market, certainly in Australia. The one that showed the biggest, most noticeable increase in aluminium during storage was actually cider products, and that sort of tallied with some of the inquiries we've been receiving at the WRI in terms of products that are showing reductive characters. Cider was certainly one of the early signs that having products in a can may be an issue if some of the parameters weren't right. So we've actually undertaken some scanning electron microscopy analysis. So we essentially cut up sections of cans from products that had cans that had product in them over that sort of 5-month period. So we cut sections of the can body and the can lid and did microscopy on those sections. And essentially what we were looking for was any indication that there might be some pitting in the surface or pinholes forming. And you can see an example of this in the image here. In the top left, these sections here are essentially pits forming in the surface of the can, and the spectra at the bottom are energy dispersive X-ray analysis plots, which gives us an elemental profile of any point on the surface. We directed the analysis point into those pits, and we can see a strong aluminium signal there. There's some organic material on the surface in terms of the residue of the wine, but what we suspected we might see was a strong aluminium signal, and that just indicates that there is a direct path for the aluminium to migrate from the can itself into the product. So what effect does that aluminium and other conditions have on the sulfur compounds that I referred to earlier? There's generally 3 key sulfides we worry about in terms of wine chemistry. So dimethyl sulfide is one, which is at low levels has a relatively pleasant blackcurrant characteristic, but at high levels tends to look a bit more like canned corn. Methane thiol, which is sort of a rotten vegetable characteristic, and hydrogen sulfide, which is more associated with a rotten egg aroma. In the canned wines we've looked at, we've only seen hydrogen sulfide to be an issue, and this is the data from those 16 commercial canned products over that 5-month period. So we've analysed at 1, 3, and 5 months. And again, there will be a background level of hydrogen sulfide in wines, irrespective of whether a can is involved. But generally, we see the formation of hydrogen sulfide increasing post-packaging for most of the products we looked at. Some of them didn't show an increase, which suggests that potentially wasn't any breakthrough in the barrier and there wasn't aluminium transfer into the product. And where there is some aluminium increase, it isn't always a linear increase. Don't forget that in wine, there is well, in canned wine, we have 2 sources for hydrogen sulfide. So we've got the bound sulfides that are inherent in the wine itself, and that can be released post-packaging dependent on the environment. So how much oxygen is present, levels of transition metals in the wine, and other factors. And we've got the H2S generated by the aluminium itself, which is that second pathway I referred to. So I'll leave Eric to talk in a bit more detail about the copper chemistry and the sulfide chemistry, but essentially there is a background level of H2S in most wines, but we've got this secondary chemical pathway that's been dictated by the aluminium transfer into the product, and that's the one that's causing the pain, because you can see in most cases all of these products are showing H2S levels significantly above the aroma perception threshold. We have done sensory analysis on all of these wines, and some of them are definitely overtly reductive and stinky. Sometimes when it's a low to medium level, it tends to manifest itself as more of a dulling of the fruit characteristics rather than a noticeable vegetable or rotten egg aroma, but it does definitely impact on the sensory characteristics of the wine. These are the sulfur dioxide levels in the wines that we looked at. Most of them are sitting below that 35 milligram per litre threshold that we use as a guide for the pack tests. I think certainly with Australian producers, there's a bit of inherent sort of caution or nervousness with SO2 because they are used to making sure that bottled wine certainly has enough sulfur dioxide to deal with any potential oxidation issues down the track. It's less of an issue with cans, as George referred to in his presentation. It's pretty much an anoxic environment. Once the wine's in package and the can's sealed, there's very, very little oxygen capable of entering the package. We have run some oxygen transmission rate testing here at the Institute, and we saw no detectable oxygen increases in those packages. We did see a change in free sulfur dioxide levels between packaging and the 5-month period, but predominantly that drop occurred during the first couple of months post-package, and that will be due to the total package oxygen when the wine was put into the can. So some of that will be the dissolved oxygen level, which is generally quite low. The remainder will be the headspace oxygen, which is dictated by essentially how well the can's filled and how well the oxygen is managed through counter pressure filling, use of inert gases, and those type of processes. So after 5 months in our study, there was only really one product that had a free sulfur dioxide level that was around the 10 milligram per litre threshold, which is the general rule of thumb certainly for white wines, when we'll start to see some of those oxidative characters appearing. So I think for wine producers, the general message with SO2 would be you can probably get away with less when you go into package, as long as the oxygen management regimes are good. And don't forget, the higher the SO2 level, the more aggressive the wine matrix. So it pushes the wine into that high risk category in terms of the impact on the can itself. Now, this is some data from the same 16 products again, but also broken down by the packaging facility that was used to package the product. And the big takeaway from this is there's a huge amount of variation in fill height in all of the commercial packages we looked at. It tends to be dictated by where they've been filled. So different co-packers will have different filling processes in place. Some of them are more capable of hitting that lower headspace level than others. And the key thing here really is the lower the headspace level, the lower the potential amount of oxygen in the package and the lower the risk from oxidation. It doesn't really affect the reduction issues per se, but generally the lower headspace will be better for the canned product and its lifetime on the shelf. Now, we've actually had a lot of trouble getting hold of total packaged oxygen data from canning lines. There's been a fair bit of nervousness around allowing access to these sort of facilities, but I was fortunate to gather some data from a US line last year, which is what I've shown on screen here. It's just a selection of a dozen cans from a canning run, and we did direct oxygen measurements on the headspace immediately after the lines were removed. The cans were removed from the line. As you can see by the blue bars, dissolved oxygen levels are pretty low, but the headspace oxygen levels somewhat variable, but much more significant. And again, LH levels are a little bit variable as well. So it suggests in this case that the line is maybe not as well controlled as it could be. Oxygen levels in this particular product may be an issue depending on the sulfur dioxide levels that are used at packaging. So it's pretty hard to get some of this data directly from the line. But if anyone's interested, I can share some testing protocols that can be used in conjunction with some of your co-packers. Copper, as I mentioned, is one of the other risk factors when putting wine into a can. With the products we looked at, there were a few that exceeded that 0.2 milligram per liter threshold. Generally, most of the wines we see, certainly in Australia, are in the region of sort of 0 to 0.5 milligram per liter. Anything above that 0.2 again puts a product into a high risk category in terms of its aggressiveness against the barrier and the potential to take part in other chemical reactions. So even if aluminium migration isn't an issue and we don't see breakthrough, high copper levels can actually lead to high hydrogen sulfide levels in the wine, especially in an anaerobic environment. And Eric will talk about that in a few minutes. A lot of the copper species we've seen in our work tends to be bound to sulfides, and some of that can be released once all the oxygen has been depleted in the package. So whether that's in a can or a bottle, residual copper can be a real pain. So limiting copper is a very good idea. Chloride levels, similar sort of spread of data to copper. There are some that are exceeding that threshold and therefore putting the wine into that high risk category. 50 mg per liter tends to be the level that is set by the can suppliers. We had 5 of these products actually exceeding those levels. We don't have a huge amount of data on chlorides in wine, particularly, but there will obviously be some inherent background levels. It's not something you can do a lot about. It's a bit like pH. You could potentially do something with it to mitigate the risk, but it's probably doing more damage to the wine if you try to make any adjustments to chloride. It's just something to be aware of. The last piece of data I want to just show you is from a small scale canning trial we set up late last year. This is part of the initial work looking to understand some of the key chemical parameters in the processes that are taking part in a can. So we basically run a small scale canning trial with a benchtop unit to look at the effect of high and low sulfur dioxide levels. We did some copper sequestration with a PVI PVP product, and I'm sure Joshua will mention that in his presentation. And we used that to scavenge out the copper prior to canning. We also looked at storage orientation because, as George has mentioned, the barrier application process with the can body and the can lid is somewhat different. With the pack tests that I've seen, there generally is a high risk factor associated with the lid rather than the body, in that the lid is potentially a weaker area in the package than the body. So we wanted to see if storage orientation affected the potential aluminium transfer in the product and resulting sulfides. All of the products were stored at elevated temperature to accelerate some of the chemistry. Now, unfortunately, we've had issues with generating much sulfide data from that trial, but I can share some of the aluminium data. So this is taken from several months post-packaging, and the key things here are that the PVI PVP treatment was effective in reducing the aluminium transfer. So the risk of aluminium breakthrough in the package was decreased when the copper was taken out of the wine. The higher SO2 levels do act as a more aggressive matrix, so we can see increased aluminium transfer in the higher SO2 variants in this trial. And on average, we saw slightly higher aluminium levels when the package was inverted. And that correlates somewhat with the risk rating that is applied by the can suppliers on those different can components. So it started to give us an indication of, yes, SO2 is a factor. If we do look at a scavenging process like PVI PVP, it appears that we can somewhat reduce the impact of the aluminium transfer. Understanding how that translates into a wine after several months on the shelf is something that we looked into next, and Eric will talk about shortly. But that's really all I wanted to talk about this morning. So just highlighting that there are some significant risk factors in putting wine into a can. Certainly working with the can suppliers and your co-packers closely to understand those risk factors and how you can mitigate the impact of some of those is important. We've seen a lot of canned wine products develop significant issues even within 1 month post-packaging, and those will be the products where those risk factors have been high, or some of those packaging processes haven't been quite so well controlled. And we've also seen that there is a potential to mitigate some of the impact of the aluminium transfer and resultant formation of H2S by taking the copper out of the process. Just a reminder that all of this is very much wine dependent. Unfortunately, wine is a very variable beast, and what we see with one wine doesn't necessarily translate to the next one. So very important with any of this type of trial work to do testing on the product that you wish to put into the can. So that's all I had. I'll hand back over to you, Joshua.
Great. Thank you so much, Neil. That was a fantastic presentation. Now we're going to move over to our next presenter, Eric Wilkes. Eric is also coming from the Australian Wine Research Institute. He's a group manager for commercial services at the AWRI, specializing in technical management. Eric has extensive experience in successfully integrating new techniques and systems into wine production and improving those already in place. He's also a past committee member of the Interwinery Analysis Group and co-author of a book on wine laboratory analysis and regular speaker at industry conferences on technical issues around wine analysis and production. Eric, are you there? Is your microphone working?
I'm living in hope.
Okay, great.
I hope it is.
Yeah, I can hear you now, so I think you're good to go.
Good stuff. Thanks for that, mate. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this seminar. We really like giving a chance to sort of get feedback and talk to people about some of the work we're doing in this space because we think it's incredibly important. So my part of the talk is more looking at the underlying issues we're seeing with the chemistry here. I am not going to be giving a complex chemistry lecture, mainly because that stuff tends to be really boring. I am a nerd. I love that stuff, I'll tell you, but I recognize that it's not for everyone. So we're going to focus on the things we can and can't do in wines, and as I said, the underlying issues. So a little bit of background before we get into the trial. And this is because especially copper chemistry is really, really poorly understood out there, not through anyone's fault, but simply that it's not simple. Anyone who claims that they understand all there is to know about wine copper chemistry is either lying or delusional. I work with all the lead researchers in that, and they sound very confident when they talk about it. But the reality is we're still learning a lot as we go along and as our techniques improve. So with copper, we're really worried about two specific issues, or two specific compounds. We talk about sulfides in general, but in cans and wines in general, H2S is without a doubt the biggest issue. As Neil's shown you earlier, it's got a threshold around 1 microgram per litre. That's not much, so doesn't need much. And yeah, rotten egg sewage like is not a descriptor any of us like on our wines. In bottled wines, we also tend to think a lot about methane file or methane file, rotten cabbage, burnt rubber, putrefaction. It tends to be a bigger issue in wine in bottles, especially with long-term storage, but all of it tends to be related to the presence of copper and other transition metals. So look, we've all been given lots of information about the chemistry and how you deal with stinky wines. I think it's been dealt with since the 1950s. And if you start having a look through the history books, people used to do a lot of odd things using copper implements and such with wine, even in prehistory. So there is actually some evidence that even though in Roman times there was use of copper to help clean up wines. So it's not exactly a new idea, but the basic chemistry everyone talks about since the 1950s has been pretty simplified. It just says if you add copper to a wine which has got H2S, you form black lumpy stuff which will fall out of solution and will no longer smell. And that's absolutely true. There's no doubt about that. It does form copper sulfide, which has essentially no smell. It's thermodynamically preferred, very, very strong reaction. If you're talking about other mercaptans, in other words, H2S with more carbons on it, you do get a very similar reaction, but it's a bit slower. If you're talking about sulfides without terminal sulfur atoms on it, then you are pretty well not going to be able to do anything. So something like dimethyl disulfide it won't react with copper because there's no terminal sulfide. But what we can do is reduce it, get it to the actual terminal sulfide or straight mercaptan, and then we can treat it with copper. So that's the old, I've got a problem with something like DMDS. I'll add a bit of ascorbic, do a few other things, then add some copper and see what happens through there. If you've got something like dimethyl sulfide and that's causing you problems, please don't add copper because you're just making your wine very coppery. It doesn't achieve anything. Anyway, that's the 1950s story. It was pretty well thought out. It sort of makes sense, but it misses a couple of really key things. The biggest one of which is chemical reactions never are just in one direction. They can go in both directions. They just tend to be favored. And the second thing is this sort of concept that all this copper sulfide just disappears and we don't have to worry about it anymore. So myth number one, we tend to think of, we add copper sulfide plus copper, sorry, we add copper sulfate to sulfide wines. I can't do a picture of a clear odorless gas, so you'll have to settle for sulfur as the representative here. And it all binds up and adds up. But when you look at the amount of sulfides you're trying to treat versus the amount of copper you're adding, it's a massive disproportionation. This slide works a little bit better with an animation, but essentially we don't add equal amounts of copper and sulfide, copper sulfate to the amount of sulfide. We add a massive excess for what we're typically seeing. So that copper is going somewhere in the system when you put it in there. So you really need to be aware of that. The second myth, and this was really shown up in a paper by Andrew Clark and friends and has been backed up by some other work in some more recent papers as well. Please feel free to search Andrew Clark's literature on Google Scholar and you'll find a heap of really cool papers. But essentially, he showed that this concept that racking or filtration or anything like that essentially just doesn't get rid of most of the copper sulfide we form. We form that copper sulfide, but we get that residual copper going through the wine. And more recent studies that we've been involved in as well have shown that the actual size of the copper sulfide molecules created, or particles created by this process, are smaller than the pore size of the filters that we're usually using. So racking and most filtration isn't removing that copper sulfide. It just gets to hang around in the wine as copper sulfide. So you're getting rid of the smell essentially initially because you're converting the H2S to a metal sulfide, but you're not removing it from the wine. And that's a really important concept to have there. Essentially because if we're not removing it from the wine, it can hang around to do something else. And that's when we get into this issue about what sort of copper we have in the process. Another study that we were involved with Andrew and Nicholas, and Charles Sturt University is a regional university in Australia which has a really great wine program, is we actually looked at the over 50 wines to try to understand what kind of copper was in there. And what it essentially found was we had all this stuff which we call non-labile copper. And a bit more digging, it turns out that pretty well all the copper we're seeing in the wine is bound up to sulfides. So the copper that you do find in the wine that you measure there is not sitting around nice and free, copper ions, doing nothing much, just waiting for something to do, like bind up a new sulfide. It's mostly there as copper sulfide, which isn't surprising because the fermentation process creates a lot of hydrogen sulfide, and if there's any copper around, it's going to grab that and be in there. So what that really tells us, and it's part of that paper that was referenced on the previous slide, or the work referenced on the previous slide, is that while we do have a lot of copper there, it's bound up as sulfides. And so any copper that we think is available to interact with new sulfides really isn't. There's just not usually that much free copper available, unless it's been added later in the event and there's been no other sulfides to bind it up. And all that bound copper sulfide, we need to remember, can go backwards. Now, I've actually done the experiment of making copper sulfide, isolating it and putting it aside in a liquid. And the simple fact is, yes, it does reconvert to H2S. Given the right conditions, it becomes stinky again. So you need to be aware that if you've got that copper sulfide in your wine, that copper bound up with sulfides in wine, it is a potential source of sulfides going forward. And it's a really important concept. And we really need to be aware that it can cause a problem. Now, won't go through this one in detail, but this is a trial that we did many years ago, or two trials that were done many years ago. And it just demonstrates that if you do have copper in wine and it's in bottle, despite the logic of we've added the copper to get rid of sulfides, they do increase over time. So after just 2 months, we saw a significant increase in H2S in bottled wine with it increased copper. And it can become really bad, as is the case in this one here for a Clare Valley Riesling, where it's only got 0.5 of copper in there, but it had a bit of protein around as well, which is a great binding agent and a source of sulfur. And it went up to 70 parts of H2S. Now, if you turn your mind back to the threshold for sulfides, which is around 1, this wine stank. This is an absolute disaster. And it all came down to residual copper in the wine. So it can be a really major issue. So the big learning I want you to sort of grab onto from all those slides we've just had, sorry, that's a big part of it through there, is that there are 2 forms of copper probably going to be available in wine. Most of it is non-labile copper, which is going to be stuff that's hanging around all the way from fermentation through to where you've added copper after fermentation, etc. It's going to be bound up copper. It's not available to remove other sulfides, and it is a risk factor because it can be something providing a source for sulfides post-packaging. There's also labile copper, which is free copper that's been added recently usually, and is available. It usually forms a tartrate complex, but that is available to interact with H2S and remove any new stinks that turn up. Okay, so what are we doing with all this when we look at wine in cans? Now, to actually try to pull apart the ideas of all the stuff that's happened in wine in cans, we decided that we needed to do a proxy for it. So what we did was we put wine into glass ampules because that's a nice sealed environment. We can replicate the sort of anaerobic environment of a can. And then we just added and subtracted all the components that we wanted to understand. And we tried to have a look at what was going on through there. And that started to give us some really good underlying information about what's going on. So the first one we want to quickly look at is what happens when we have contact with aluminium. And it's pretty straightforward. You know, if you have aluminium in contact with wine, you get stinky H2S and, to a lesser extent, methane thiol. There's absolutely no pros about having aluminium in contact with wine. Since the 1940s, 1950s, it's known to be a problem. So it seems to be a big driver of the formation of sulfides. We are still working through the chemistry. It seems to be accentuated by the presence of copper, which is not unusual. A lot of these transition metal interactions are because of coupled redox cycles, where the classic one for oxidation in wine is iron and copper. It seems that copper and aluminium can work together quite nicely in wine to do all sorts of things, especially interacting with SO2. A really important note here is, and this is something that we're using as part of our research going forward, is if you add aluminium salts, in other words, aluminium chloride or something like that, you don't see this impact at all. It's only when you start off with aluminium metal. We used aluminium foil. Hey, it worked. And so that's really important that we understand that it is really a corrosion process with the aluminium, where you're going from aluminium metal to some aluminium charged species. So what happens when we put aluminium in contact with copper salts? This was really interesting because we were originally trying to understand in this trial, does this free copper make a massive difference to the ability of aluminium to create the sulfides? And its impact was relatively small, but once we started thinking about it, we were adding labile copper, and this has been driving a lot of our understanding of copper in wine, full stop. So in this trial, rather than looking at a lot of copper that was already in the wine, we were looking at fresh copper, which we've added. So what's probably happening in this case is the aluminium is generating sulfides. It probably is interacting with the copper, but because we have that copper floating around there, then that means that newly generated H2S is being bound up. So yeah, the copper is probably in this case acting as a scavenger very successfully to mitigate the strength of what's happening with the aluminium. But we really have to keep in mind that that could turn around a bit later in the wine's life and cause us more grief. Increasing pH. Lots of talk about this. All the chemistry tells us very clearly that if we increase pH, we should be able to reduce the impact of these things. And yeah, it works. No doubt about it at all. Increasing pH has a strong and really obvious impact on the production of sulfides in the presence of aluminium. We take it as given that aluminium is going to be available in a lot of these things because we're seeing that in our canned wine studies. The con is that this is not a practical winemaking approach. We need to make wine to meet a flavor profile, not we need to make a wine so that it's suitable to go into the package. Our package needs to meet our wine requirements. So if you're talking about spritzy products, which a lot of people are, well, you've got CO2 in there, you've got carbonic acid. You really don't have the choice of massively increasing pH because you'll change your wine style. Most of the wines people are looking at are whites, rosés, and as I say, spritz products, which are all on the low pH side. So while this is effective, it's a real problem from a winemaking process. Increasing oxygen. We wanted to have a look at this and see if we could manage it. And yep, having increased oxygen in the system does seem to help mitigate the presence of H2S. That's essentially exactly no surprise. The con is obviously in this, we don't want to oxidize our wines. I do know some wine companies have tried hyperoxidizing or hyperoxygenating the wine, it's making sure there's a lot of oxygen in wine before they went into can. And what they definitely didn't have any problems with production of H2S or reduced odors. They did end up with brown oxidized wine in can pretty quickly. So yeah, probably not the option that most people want to go to, but it probably highlights that we might be able to find a sweet spot for the amount of oxygen that should be in a can when we go to package. So aluminium plus reducing the amount of SO2, and this seems to have worked quite well. So in this trial, we actually used hydrogen peroxide to reduce the amount of sulfur dioxide available, and it does, in the presence of aluminium foil, seem to significantly reduce the amount of H2S produced. Now, this is a really positive concept because we do know we don't have to worry about oxidation in cans anywhere near as much. Modern packaging lines do seem to be microbially stable. So if we can control our oxygen and if we can make sure our product's going in a sanitary measure into the package, we probably will be able to use this as a mitigation process, reducing SO2. It's got a lot of promise. And now this one is another quite interesting one, and I've got a random mouse wandering around my screen, which I'm hoping you guys aren't seeing. It's nothing to do with me. We have tried stripping the original copper out using one of the PVI PVP polymers that we're going to have a talk about in a few minutes. I am trying to get us going through this as quickly as possible so that Joshua can give his section. And what we're trying to do here is essentially just remove that copper sulfide. So one of the big findings of using some of these modern polymers to remove copper is we don't think they're removing just the copper. We think they're removing the copper sulfide. So if we can pull that out, then we've got a much better chance of taking away one of the big sources. And so not having any copper there to interact with the aluminium and pulling away one of the sources of our sulfides, copper sulfide, seems to be a really effective way of trying to do this. So we're stripping non-labile copper, taking away a source of the original sulfides, which seem to be a problem, and yeah, could be a really positive mitigation process. Stripping the original copper and adding more copper. We weren't really sure about doing this one, but it does seem to work. So this is really strip the original copper. So do the process to your wine, strip out as much copper as you can. You're removing copper sulfides, and that means you're making the wine more robust and less likely to form stinky sulfides in package. And then adding a little bit more copper, which will be the labile copper. So hopefully we've got rid of all the copper sulfides, so there's no sulfides there. So what copper we've got left is only bound up to tartrates. And then that copper should be available to scavenge any sulfides that are generated through the interaction of SO2 and aluminium. Now, this in our initial trials does seem to have worked quite effectively. It gave us a good result. However, it is a high risk thing to do because copper can do all sorts of other things going forward. So I think it's one of these areas where we need to have a bit more understanding. We know that stripping the original copper is really effective and there's really no harm. Adding more copper afterwards, we don't know what all the interactions are going to be with all the wines, and a few more trials need to be done there. And in the presence of aluminium, yeah, we see that it's not quite as effective, but it does still have an impact through there. So what can we do? What's the big takeouts we're up to at the moment? Remove the aluminium source. If we can get rid of the aluminium in the process, then we are probably going to be to the equivalent of a bottled wine. In pretty well all cases. Yes, we're a lower oxygen source, but if we don't have that aluminium there, it doesn't seem to be causing grief. Unfortunately, a winery, that's not something a winery can do anything about in process. It really is working with your can manufacturer And as George said earlier, developing an understanding of what ones work, where they fit into the process. We can strip the non-labile copper, in other words, the copper sulfides out of there using products like PVI, PVP. Josh is going to talk about them in a few minutes. That seems to be really effective. Reducing the amount of sulfur oxide, yep, that does look like it's going to be a positive as well. As long as we understand the sanitary status of our lines and the amount of oxygen that we're dealing with in TPO, that really does seem to be a really positive process. And we can think about adding more copper after we've stripped out the original copper to give us a protective thing. I still think that's going to be on a wine by wine basis, and it's a pretty high risk strategy. I'm hoping that as we do more trials, we'll understand it, and hopefully we're developing some testing at the moment, which with a bit of luck, will be able to tell people what that risk is. And so people will be able to make that decision going forward. Okay, so I'm sorry that we're going over in our talks and that's a bit rushed, but yeah, thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. That was a great presentation. I think we're all much more knowledgeable about copper now and its effects in canned wines. So really appreciate your work that you've done there. So I'm going to quickly just go through a few slides talking about analysis and treatments for canned wine. Again, I know that we're a little bit over time here, but hopefully if you can stick around for a little bit longer, we can get through this brief presentation, and then we can do some question and answers for everybody at that time. So just a general overview. I'm going to talk about analysis and tracking for canned wines first, and then talk about removing metals with Clairol HM and StableMet, which are two tools that are available for finding out metals in wine. So this last year we launched our tracking canning packaging panel of Inquiry Labs. And we included these parameters because we think that these are important for tracking canned products over time. So the first parameter is actually aluminum. So we saw in previous presentations the importance of aluminum and how the aluminum level tends to increase over time in some canned products, depending on the wine itself and depending on the liner that's being used. We may see that level increase more or less. But having an initial aluminum level allows us to determine how quickly we have potential for leaching of aluminum into the wine, and how quickly we might be coming across reduction issues in the future. So aluminum, I think, is a very important parameter just to keep an eye on for your QC process in your canned wine. So I recommend doing that initially so that you have an idea of how much aluminum is in the wine in the beginning, and then you can track that over time to see how it changes. pH is obviously important for reasons that were mentioned earlier by, I believe, Neil and also Eric, that an increase in pH or higher pH tends to have less issues with hydrogen sulfide. So it's just a good idea to have an idea of what the pH is going to be. This may be related to molecular SO2. We're not really sure about that yet, and I'll talk about that more in a couple of minutes, but having an idea of what the pH is obviously important as well. Free and total SO2. Having a lower free and total SO2 will aid in preventing some of the reduction that happens in the can. As we saw, higher SO2 levels tend to lead to more H2S being produced because that SO2 is reacting with the aluminum and forming H2S. So the less SO2 that we have, the less likely we are to have that happen. We do see drops in free SO2 when we have some reactions happening due to the aluminum and the SO2. So that's another important thing to track over time is how is the free SO2 changing, and also what is our initial free SO2. The lower the free is in the beginning, the less likely we are to have that H2S forming. And then copper, I have here a level of less than 0.3 milligrams per liter. Obviously, Neil spoke about 0.2 milligrams per liter is probably a better number in terms of just being as safe as possible. But copper is certainly one of the more important parameters that we need to pay attention to, as we saw from both Neil and Eric's presentation. And I'll be focusing on copper removal with the stable met and Clairol HM in just a couple of minutes. Iron is another recommended parameter to look at from liner manufacturers, and then chlorides as well. There's a little bit of a error right here. This should be 50 milligrams per liter is recommended by liner manufacturers. Less than that, and the chlorides is important for less H2S production. And then I do recommend doing triplicate analysis on your QC, because there can be some big differences from can to can, even in the same canning run. So I do recommend doing triplicate analysis at least to make sure that your numbers are correct. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just talk about metal removal. So I'm going to talk about two different compounds that are available to winemakers right now for removing metals, and in particular copper. Because we saw copper's influence on reduction in canning is so important. That's why these two tools become very useful for winemakers with canned wines. So PVI PVP, this is a polymer which binds several different kinds of metals. We know that it binds copper. We also know that it can bind copper bound to sulfur. So it can remove copper and copper sulfides. It also removes smaller phenolics like hydroxycinnamates. So it has a benefit in terms of removing some bitter compounds, and those compounds that can also lead to browning and some white wines. So there's an added benefit from an oxidation standpoint by removing some of the compounds that can oxidize. It also removes catalyzers of oxidation, which are the metals like copper and iron, and it removes copper, which can interact to or it removes copper-bound sulfides, which can eventually release H2S in the canning process. So PVI PVP is one polymer that's available for metal removal. Chitosan, typically winemakers think of chitosan for its antimicrobial activities, but there are different forms available of chitosan for different kinds of activities, and so the processing of this material can make a product that can do different things. So there is a form of chitosan that's good for antimicrobial effects, and there's a form of chitosan that's actually really good at removing metals. And so chitosan has that ability to be able to bind metals and remove them. In the same way, it can also remove copper-bound sulfides, and so it's really useful for canning for that reason. It also has the ability to remove smaller phenolics, so it helps with oxidation as well. So with those polymers in mind, I'm going to talk about two enological tools that are available to you for removing metals. Enartis has two products that I'm going to talk about: Clairol HM and Stable Met. Stable Met is basically pure PVI PVP with silica. So again, this can remove copper, iron, and copper-bound sulfides. So for wines that you're trying to lower the copper level before canning, this polymer becomes really useful for that. In a trial where this is just one example of the effect of the Stable Met on removing copper. If you look over on the right, there is a chart. We had no treatment. We had treatment with 16 grams per hectoliter of Stable Met and 32 grams per hectoliter. The initial level was 1.8 milligrams per liter, which is a very high level of copper. And with just 16 grams per hectoliter, we were able to drop it down to about 0.4 milligrams per liter. At 32 grams per hectoliter, we were able to drop it below our detection threshold limit at 0.05 milligrams per liter. So within the dosage range, you can pull out a lot of copper with this polymer. So Stable Met is basically the pure form of the PVI PVP. Clairol HM is a blend basically between the PVI PVP, which is the polymer, and chitosan that is specific for metal removal. So this is a really useful tool for metal removal. I like using this one a little bit more than the Stable Met because I see more consistent results in terms of removal of copper and iron across different types of wines. Because of the blend of the polymer and the chitosan, you have two compounds that have different activities, and I just find that I have better results more consistently with the Clairol HM. When we look at its removal of copper and iron and aluminum, here on the right you'll see the red wine. The control had 3.7 ppm of copper. With 50 grams per hectoliter of Clairol HM, we were able to drop that by 60%. So that's a big drop in copper. In this white wine, if we look at the copper level at 3.7, again, with a 50 gram per hectoliter addition of chloral HM, we were able to drop it down to 1.1. So that's 70% removal. So very effective in terms of removing copper, iron, and aluminum. Here's just a little comparison to show you the two different compounds. So on the y-axis, we have copper in milligrams per liter. We have two different squares here. On the left square with the blue bars, that is a trial that we did with a Pinot Noir. And the right square is the red bars, or the reddish bars that are a treatment of Cabernet Sauvignon. So we treated this wine with two different dosages of stable met and two different dosages of chloral HM. And you can see in the Pinot with 20 grams per hectoliter, we dropped the level from 0.4 milligrams per liter down to 0.1 milligrams per liter, which would be really helpful in a canning situation where you're trying to get the level below 0.2 milligrams per liter to provide more safety. And then at 50 grams per hectoliter, we were able to drop it down to below detection threshold. Similarly with the chloral HM, at 20 grams per hectoliter, we dropped it down to just above 0.1 ppm. And then with 50 grams per hectoliter, we were able to remove all of it below detection threshold limit. And then looking over at this Cabernet Sauvignon, the control was just above 0.25 milligrams per liter. With 20 grams per hectoliter of stable met, we dropped it down to just above 0.15. But then when we increased the dosage to 50 grams per hectoliter, we found that we weren't removing any more of that copper. So we had kind of reached our maximum with the stable met. Similarly with the chloral HM, at 20 grams per hectoliter, we were on the same level as the stable met, but as we increased the dosage to 50 grams per hectoliter, we were able to remove all of the copper below detection threshold limit. So this is another reason why I prefer to use the chloral HM, but both are very good options for removing metals. And then lastly, I'm just going to talk about if you did decide that you want to work with the chloral HM or stable met, here's a couple of tips that you could use for doing trials. Firstly, the product needs to be rehydrated before you use it. So I recommend 1 hour of rehydration time. I usually make a base solution of around 5 to 10% of chloral HM or stable met and just allow it to rehydrate for an hour. The product settles incredibly fast, which is really useful for processing speed. So if you need to treat a tank and can it very soon after that, the product settles very quickly. But this can be a problem too if you're doing trials. So if you look at this image down here, you can see when I had just mixed up the product, you can see it's pretty uniformly within the solution. But after 1 minute, you can see that there's a pretty good pellet of the material that had dropped out of suspension. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is that if you're doing trials, just make sure that you keep the product in suspension when you're taking an aliquot, because you could be basically delivering the wrong dosage in a trial basis. Pipette tips is just another little piece of information. We recommend using a wide orifice pipette tip because otherwise you can have some clogging when you're pipetting the solution. So just keep that in mind. And then contact time during a trial should be the same as treatment in the cellar. So 30 minutes to an hour contact time in a trial situation. You should repeat that same amount of time at least in when you're actually doing the addition in the winery. So just a couple of quick conclusions. Analysis via canning panel at Vinquery Labs can be helpful for tracking and monitoring canned wines. Chloral HM and stable met can both benefit canned products for removing copper and copper-bound sulfides. And then trials of chloral HM and stable met can be tricky, so consider provided guidelines if you decide to try either finding agent. And after this webinar is complete, we will be sending a follow-up email that has these guidelines in a PDF for you. So if you decide to do trials with the chloral HM or stable met, that's going to be available to you as well. And we have decided that there's so much information around the canned wine topic that we couldn't fit into this webinar that we decided to do a second part 2. So this one focused mostly on the metals aspect and how metals affect reduction in wine. We touched a little bit on SO2 earlier, but we want to develop more of the impacts of SO2. Cornell has done a lot of great work with specifically how SO2 is impacting the canned wine situation. And so we've partnered with Cornell, and we're going to be doing a joint webinar on June 18th at 1 p.m. So we're going to be joined by Gavin Sachs and Rachel Allison to do that presentation. They're going to talk about the impact of SO2 in a little bit more detail, and then we'll talk about some solutions for low SO2 winemaking as well. And that pretty much does it for the presentation portion of the webinar. Thank you everybody for joining up into this point. I know that we are definitely over time here. We are going to continue to do some question and answer. So if you want to stick around and do question and answers, I will be around. I know that Eric might not be around much longer because he has a meeting that he has to get to immediately. And I don't know if Neil will be able to stick around, but if you guys are able to stick around, I will stick around for a little bit longer. I'm going to open up a question and answer function right now. And so if you look at the chat box, you should be able to switch over to the question and answer mode. If you type in there your questions, we're going to go ahead and try and answer them. If you want to direct a question specifically to a presenter, just go ahead and mention their name. Otherwise, if you don't really care who answers the question, but you just want to hear an answer, we'll go ahead and try and field that question as best we can. So I'm just going to kind of go back through. I know that we were a couple questions during the actual presentation that were asked. I'm going to go ahead and pull those up in just a moment. Okay, so I have a question from Ellie Correll who asks, does the Valspar BPF work well with sulfites? George, did you care to want to answer that one?
Good question. Right now, I don't have. I do know that they are commercial with that in California, and they're using it as a trial basis, but that's on beer and soft drinks. Not sure if anyone's using it on wine. Those of you who are bottling or canning wine might know what you're using if you're using it.
Yeah, I have not heard much information about the liners specifically in terms of the Valspar, but it would be interesting to know how many people are using it as well. So hopefully people will start using that website that you had posted. What was that website again, George?
Beer and wine packaging performance.
Beer and wine packaging performance. Yeah, if we can get more information collected in one spot, I think that would definitely help. So we got a couple more questions here. I'm going to go ahead and put those up. So Serena Belfonte asks, sorry, so the internal coating defends the product from metal interactions that can degrade the material or induce transfer. So George, I think this is a question for you. She basically is asking if the internal coating is defending from the metal interactions.
Yeah, well, initially the coating is protecting the can from the beverage. If you do have some attack through the coating, then yeah, maybe it's going to help protect the wine from the metal. But on the other hand, if you've gotten something through, you've already got a pinhole, so you're already in trouble. It's mainly to protect the can.
Okay. We have another question from Joseph Starr who asks, any thoughts on hard cider and epoxy? Well, we saw that hard cider definitely can have some increased aluminum levels. George, what are your thoughts on epoxy with hard cider?
My gut is of any of the coatings. This is just in general chemistry for paint chemistry. Epoxy is going to be I think, is the best starting point. The epoxy acrylate coating that was used in cans for 40, 50 years did better than the polyesters, the vinyls, the acrylics. And that's what people were using. It was the most successful. Track records count. Yes, this is a new market, but it would be my go-to. You occasionally get surprised by something new that works better, but that's my gut feeling right now.
Okay.
It's to start with the epoxy acrylate if you can.
Josh,
okay, great. Yeah.
I just thought from a beverage chemistry point of view, one of the things to think about with ciders is they tend to have a little bit more protein in them than wines, and proteins and copper and aluminium, if they do get into wine, are going to be great sources of stinky sulfides, a bit like that Riesling I showed earlier in one of my slides. So I'm not sure I default to George in a big way about which is the better coating, but if you are seeing failures in any product, then yeah, cider is going to be probably at a higher risk than a typical wine.
I think we lost your audio there, Eric. I missed the last bit there, but it sounded like proteins might be one of the issues with
Yep.
ciders.
So have you got me again there now?
Yep, I've got you now. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think independent of the liners, yeah, I think ciders are at a higher risk than typical wines for metal interactions. So that's just yeah, I default to George about the best liner, but if you're getting to have failures of that liner, aluminium and that protein and copper interaction is definitely going to cause you problems.
You know, just so everyone's understanding, this is new turf, new territory. You know, the naive will say, "All right, you've been doing soft drinks with phosphoric acid for years, or you know, you've been doing beer with alcohol and so some sulfites." But it is a new pack, it is a new environment, and it's all groundbreaking, and you're going to have problems.
Yeah, and I don't know that we have a lot of information on how much copper levels are inside of cider as well, in terms of if there's any residual vineyard sprays or if how much copper is being used anyways. So that might be another thing as well. I don't know if Neil or Eric, if you have any idea of the levels of copper that you find in ciders.
Not great information yet because we haven't been approached with a lot of them yet, but I am seeing residual copper in there. And from my time working with a large beverage company, they weren't afraid to use some degree of copper in their process post fermentation if they started to see any smells.
Got it. Okay, well, I've got a couple more questions here. Let's move on to the next one. So what is the best current liner currently for carbonated, sweet, low pH, low alcohol wine products? Seems a little specific, but George, you want to try for that one?
Good luck.
Punt.
Well, maybe that Valspar would be a good candidate.
It's as good a place as any. I mean, some of you are canning right now. Does anyone know what they're actually using? Or do you just buy the cans and take what you get?
Yeah, it's a good question. If anybody wants to try and type in the chat box if they know what their liner is, I'll move on to the next question. We'll see if we get some answers there.
Joshua, I might just jump in there from an Australian perspective. Most producers would have discussions with the can suppliers over the products they intend to put into a can. Something like carbonated sweet low pH, it's going to put the wine probably into that high risk category, which a supplier would typically flag. The ones we work with over here, there's maybe a couple of different liner options, and they will run some pack tests and give you some indication that you might be having trouble with this particular product, and that may actually trigger some reformulation or some rethinking over whether they put the product into a can, because some products will just be too high risk.
Yep, that makes sense.
All right, so I see a lot of people are using Gen 2 from Ball and Crown, but Ball or Crown is the can maker, not the coating maker.
Yeah, so it looks like we had a couple people say that vendor won't tell you. So
it's the way it goes. But Gen 2 seems to be the one that's running.
Okay. Well, let's move on to this next one. So Michael Gorzinski is asking, has a study been conducted on the exterior can denting with respect to flexibility of the interior liner and the resultant effects of metal exposure on the product? So are dents making the product worse, basically? Does anybody have an answer to that one?
No, I'd be surprised if it made a difference.
Only, it has. I mean, I do know that when I was working in the soft drink industry for a very short period of time, anytime they saw dented cans coming off the line, they panicked because they saw massively increased corrosion. And they actually saw pallet failures because one can would start leaking and destroy the cardboard through there. We did a few sort of little tests on it. I don't think there's been a really good trial, but it is something that has concerned people in distribution because they do get very nervous that if they see the cans gets crimped, probably more than just dented, but crimped, yeah, that seems to be a much higher risk of corrosion when that happens. But I don't have really good figures or trials on it for different liners.
No, it's not something we've specifically looked at, but I would be inherently concerned if I saw dents in cans because it's likely to increase the risk of the internal surface providing a pathway for aluminium transfer.
Yeah.
Generally, with the filling process, you try and get the right degree of overpressure so that the can is a bit more solid and resistant to being bumped around and banged around in the distribution chain.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think probably cans with dents should be removed or at least taken off the line. It looks like we have another question from Annie. I'm going to say this wrong. BBtron. Which any resources for canning ready-to-drink spirits or products? Are you guys aware of anyone working on ready-to-drink spirits by chance?
There's an awful lot of them in the marketplace, at least in Australia already. Essentially, the underlying beverage chemistry doesn't lend itself to formation of these reductive compounds. Anyway, you don't have the things that you need to worry about for a lot of those. So they do seem to be a little bit problems with them. Some of the large companies will make the comment, at least their marketing divisions, that the people drinking those ready-to-drink spirits are not as picky as wine connoisseurs anyway. So maybe not noticing problems, but the history of using ready-to-drink spirits in cans is pretty long, and chemistry is probably a lot closer to what we see for soft drinks anyway, which just don't tend to have the same problems. As George said, you know, there's a long history there.
All right, moving on to the next one. So do the body and lid coatings have any breakdown with bead rolling, sealing? That would be slightly larger headspace would be needed, from Anthony Cefali.
In the seaming area up where the sealing compound is, there might be some, but you know, it's sealed in with the compound. I've torn down a lot of seams over the years, and since we went away from steel cans, we haven't really had many issues with that.
Got it. All right, we'll move on to the next question. Ellie Carell asks, if Gen 2s are no longer available for cider, is there anything you would recommend to lessen the issues if we end up having to use Gen 1s? I would say check to see if the copper levels of the product are high, and if they are, maybe consider removing the copper. Another thing you could look at is lowering the SO2 levels. I think if you have some way of controlling the microbial growth within the can, then lowering the SO2 levels is really just to control for oxidation. And so I find that a lot of people that are canning are still using really high SO2 levels, similar to what they would see in a product like, you know, bottled wine and so I would consider lowering the SO2 levels if possible in that situation as well to lessen any chances of SO2 of H2S from occurring. Does anybody else have a comment on that one?
No.
No? Okay. All right. So Patrick Kamain is saying, I think cider would have higher levels of copper, and he thinks he's going to start measuring that. That's great. We'll hopefully see some information from Patrick about that at some point. Austin Montgomery asked, do any of you speakers have insight into how different alloys perform in wine corrosive beverage? Is that financially feasible option for manufacturers?
Ooh.
I'm
I
not sure I
think
understand that
with
question.
Is that a different alloy
I
for the aluminum can?
Maybe
That seems
that's
like
maybe that's the question. Is it a different alloy?
that seems like a long shot unless you're somebody as big as one of the soft drink companies.
Yeah, and I think the costs you're talking about increasing to those sort of things, and because you're changing production processes as well. But the reality is, wine is actually quite an aggressive solvent, if you like. It's got all those nice organic acids that can do all sorts of stuff through there. We're probably going to see wine attack most of the sort of alloys which are suitable for can forming. So unless you're going to go to high-grade stainless steel cans, which is probably unlikely, I think we're going to see the same sort of problems anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Tori Arvik is asking, does copper catalyze the degradation of proteins in wine, etc.? Do you care to touch on that, Eric?
Yeah, copper and proteins have got a long history. Degradation is part of the process, agglomeration. So copper and proteins form wonderful hazes in wine. And when they do that, they seem to release a lot of sulfides. So yes, copper does lead to very strong interactions with proteins in wine. There's even some old papers which suggested that proteins can interact with copper sulfides, leading to the release of some of the sulfides. But I think that's a bit of a long stretch. But yeah, there's no doubt that copper plus proteins is not a good combination in wine. Unfortunately, it's not a good way of removing proteins from wine, because all you do is release lots of fragments of stuff which come back to bite you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like protein levels in copper too might be an interesting thing to look at in the future. So here we have another question from John Levenberg, who asks, could storing cans at cooler temperatures help prevent breakdown or pitting in the liners? Any thoughts on that, George or Eric or Neil?
Chemistry tells me kinetics slow down. Barrier properties are better at lower temperatures. It helps. I don't know if it's going to be noticeable or significant. The theory is there that it should help.
I think, totally agree. Whether it's practical in a proper supply chain process, and that's where we tend to end up falling back to, is we don't have that much control once something ends up in the store or those sort of things. It's not a high enough value product for people to actually say, all right, we have to refrigerate this all the way through supply chain. So yeah, kinetics would suggest that it's going to slow things down. I'm pretty sure it would slow down the formation of sulfides in general, but A, can you control it enough, and B, would it be significant? Yeah, I don't think so. Not really.
All right. We have a question from. We can take a couple more questions, and then I think probably we'll have to cut it off, because I know that we're a little bit over time here, and I want to be respectful to our panel of presenters as well. So we have one more question from Brian Carlson. Asks, why are Gen 2 no longer available for cider? I had not heard that. Has anybody else heard about Gen 2 not being available for cider?
No.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the next one.
I heard Gen 1 had a lot of problems. That's why we're at Gen 2.
Yeah. It could be maybe that with the increased alcohol sales, perhaps the Gen 2 liner is limited at this point. I'm not sure.
Mm.
Kara Morrison asks, I understand there are not many manufacturers for wine cans, so how many liners are commercially available to the wine industry? George, you want to take a whack at that one?
I probably not many. There aren't. For years, the two-piece can liner industry was controlled by one or two companies because the can plants were so large. Everything was done in large shipments. It wasn't like you'd sell them a drum of it. It was tank cars. So the Valspar, Sherwin-Williams. Years ago, Glidden was one of them. You don't have a lot of players just because it's one of those things, you've got it all or you got nothing.
Yeah, it's still a new space, right?
Especially for wine, it's new. I mean, I'm just thinking for beer beverage cans. The cans in general. You don't have many suppliers for that. It's not like going to the hardware store and picking up what you want for paint. Yeah. These are all specialty products. Something I can say about this, though, and maybe time will tell, most of the body coatings are waterborne. And just like storage temperature, my gut tells me that a solvent base gives you better barrier properties. Don't have the data to prove it, but from a chemistry perspective, it just makes a lot of sense. And maybe someday they find out they actually, to do a large variety of packs like this, they have to come up with a new coating. I don't know. It's just, we may be facing that. You might get a few wins here or there, but if you really want to do wine in a broad sense, you might need a new product.
Makes sense. And maybe if enough wineries come together and can show that the increase of sales is enough, maybe we can get somebody to budge and make something more specific for wine.
Yeah.
Okay, we got just one or two more questions if you guys can stick around for just that. We have a question about pasteurization. I think this is an interesting one. Does tunnel pasteurization have an effect on the chemical makeup of the wine and integrity of the liners? George, you want to take a whack at that one?
Going back to your temperature, I mean, cans have been pasteurized for years, but it's with different products inside. That heat's going to make it more aggressive. It's something I would definitely be wanting to test before I jumped on that.
So it could be that pasteurization is making the changing the liner integrity, right? Because
it's the heat is going to speed up it's going to speed up the reactions. It's going to expand the coating and make it more porous. Heat's not your friend.
Yeah, and that brings up another point too that we haven't really had a chance to address too, which is the storage of the cans themselves. Within commercial settings, it seems like a bottle might not get treated the same way as a can. So for distributors, I imagine wineries should make sure that the distributors are aware of the heat sensitivity of the product as well, just to ensure that they're not getting stored, in temperatures that are, that you would see in, say, soft drinks or something like that. It seems like temperature is still a very important factor here. Sorry, I cut you off there, Eric. Did you want to?
Yeah, just without getting into liners and that, I have actually been involved in wine in pasteurization trials, both in bottles and a really limited one in cans, and it did nothing good. It was not a raging success. There are some companies that do pasteurize grape juice as zero alcohol wine, because they have no real choice, but grape juice tends to be a bit more open to that. But on wine products, we saw some, it changed the wine chemistry. It had things, and if you got any proteins there, it goes pear-shaped. Lots of issues with pinging wine up, even for short periods of time, to those sort of temperatures.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, I think we've probably exhausted our time here, but I'm sorry if we can't get to all the questions that we have. I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you so much, Eric, George, and Neil for joining us for this. It really was a great presentation, and I think it was a really successful webinar. And I just want to thank you guys for coming and presenting today. Just for all the information for the people still here, if you wanted to reach out for samples for any of the Clairol HM or the Stable Met, either the products we talked about today, feel free to email our order desk at enartis.com. We'll get some samples sent out to you. For any additional questions, feel free to email me, joshua.karasak@enartis.com. I'm happy to talk about canning or discuss any technical aspects related to canning. Keep in mind that we will have a follow-up webinar after this related to SO2 and canning, so keep your eye out for the registration for that. And again, thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.